Hey guys, and welcome back to another True Crime Tuesday. But before we get into today's video, I just want to do the usual. So my name's Amber. I upload beauty, fashion and lifestyle content, but on a Tuesday I like to throw in a little bit of true crime. So if they're the type of videos that you like to watch, then why not hit that subscribe button and come along and join our little family. And if you're already part of the family, then make sure that notification bell switched on just so you're notified of whenever I upload a video. Why not give me a thumbs up and leave a comment down below. Now we can get right into today's video. So guys, I like to do a quick disclaimer before I enter any case. This does contain adult themes and adult references. If that makes you feel uncomfortable in any way, then please feel free to click off this video. There are plenty of other videos over on my channel that you can feel free to watch. But anyway guys, let's get into today's case. So today's case is a very interesting case, and it's one that I heard about a little while ago. It is one that if any of you have studied psychology, you've probably heard of it, because this case is infamous with an effect called the bystander effect, and that is basically where people stand by and watch a crime and think, oh yeah, that's fine, someone else will have phoned, and no one has actually phoned. It's sort of like waiting and watching and thinking, oh, someone else will call that in, don't worry about it. And this is the murder of Kitty Genovese. Now, for you guys that don't know, she was a young woman who was basically brutally stabbed. While it is thought over 30 people just stood by and watched in the nearby apartments. So that is why this case has become infamous with the bystander effect, and that is why it's so heavily linked to the bystander effect. Now, there are a lot of myths surrounding this case which we will get into later, but first I just want to get in and give a little bit of background about Kitty before we discuss the case. So Catherine Susie Kitty Genovese was born on July 7th in 1935, and she was born in Brooklyn, New York. She was the eldest of 5 children of Italian-American parents, Rachel and Vincent and Adele Genovese. She was raised Catholic, and in her teenage years she attended an all-girl high school. She was recalled as being very self-assured beyond her years. She was a very confident girl. Her mother witnessed a murder which caused her to pick her family up and leave to New Canaan in Connecticut, which was in 1954. But Kitty, who was recently graduated from high school, decided that she wanted to stay in Brooklyn with her grandparents. So she moved to an apartment in Brooklyn and she started to do clerical jobs, and she found this very unappealing. So by the late 1950s she actually accepted a position as a bartender, and in August 1961 she was actually briefly arrested for bookmaking, as she'd been taking bets on horse races from patrons in the bar. She and her friend Dee Guneri were both fined $50 each, and she actually lost her job. She then held another bartending position at a bar called Ev's 11th Hour Bar on Jamaica Avenue and 193rd Street, which was in Hollis, Queens. And with this bar, it didn't take long until she was actually managing the bar because of its absentee owner. She was working double shifts and she was able to save up a lot of money, which she actually intended to open up her own Italian restaurant, but unfortunately her life was cut short and this never happened. She shared her Kew Gardens apartment at 82 to 70 Austin Street with her girlfriend Mary Ann Zelenko, whom she met in 1963. So now I'm just going to get into the day of the crime and what actually happened on the day of the crime. So it was approximately 2:30 AM on March 13th 1964, and Kitty had left the bar where she was working. She drove home in her red Fiat, and she was waiting for a traffic light to change on Hoover Avenue, and this is where she was spotted by Winston Mosley. He was sitting around in his parked car. Kitty arrived home at around 3:15 and she parked her car in the Kew Gardens Long Island Railroad Station parking lot, which was about 100 feet away from her apartment door. It was in an alleyway at the back of the building. She walked towards her apartment complex, and Mosley, who had followed her home, he'd exited his car and followed her. He'd parked at a corner bus stop on Austin Street. He was actually armed with a hunting knife and he approached Kitty. So Kitty seen this threat coming towards her and she ran towards the front of her building, but Mosley had ran after her and he actually managed to overtake her and he stabbed her twice in the back. Kitty screamed out, quote, "Oh my god, he stabbed me, help me," end quote. Several neighbours heard her cry, but only a few of them recognised it as a sound as a cry for help. And Robert Moser, one of the neighbours, actually shouted down to the attacker, quote, "Let that girl alone," end quote. So Mosley did run away because he was aware there were people watching him. Kitty slowly crawled toward the entrance of her her building, and she was seriously injured at this point, but she was out of view of a lot of witnesses. So witnesses did see Moseley enter his car and drive away, but then he returned 10 minutes later. So he had a wide-brimmed hat which was shadowing his face. He systematically searched the parking lot, the train station and an apartment complex after eventually finding Kitty. She was barely conscious and lying in a hallway at the back of the building in a pool of her own blood. There was a locked door that had actually prevented her from getting into the apartment building. At this point she was out of the view of the street and those who may have heard or seen the initial attack. Moseley then decided that he was going to stab Kitty several more times before he raped her, and he stole $49 from her, and then he ran away again. The attack spanned approximately half an hour, and the knife wound in Kitty's hand suggested that she had attempted to defend herself from him. A neighbour and a close friend called Sophia Farrar found her shortly after and held her in her arms. Records of the earliest calls for this case to the police were unclear and they were not given a high priority. The incident actually occurred 4 years before New York City had implemented the 911 emergency call system. One witness had said that his father had called the police after the initial attack and reported that a woman was beat up but had got up and was staggering around. A few minutes after the final attack, another witness, Carl Ross, called 2 friends for advice on what to do. Why would you be calling for advice? Why would you not be calling the police? The second of whom called a third friend, and then he called the police, who arrived to the scene within minutes of that call. So Kitty was picked up by an ambulance at 4:15 a.m. and she died en route to the hospital. Kitty's girlfriend, Mary Ann Zelenko, was questioned by Detective Mitchell Sang at 7 a.m. the morning after the murder. She was interrogated for 6 hours by 2 homicide detectives, John Carroll and Jerry Burns, whose questioning was actually centred around her relationship with Kitty. This was also the police's focus when they questioned the couple's neighbours, and initially Amy was considered to be a suspect. So on March 19th, 1964, 6 days after the stabbing, Winston Moseley was arrested for a suspected robbery in Ozone Park, Queens. A television set had been discovered in the trunk of his car, and a neighbour who was called Rahul Cleary became very, very suspicious when he saw Moseley, who claimed to be a removal worker, removing the television from a neighbour's house. He decided that he was going to consult with another neighbour, Jack Brown, who confirmed the home warmers were not moving. Cleary decided that it was time to call the police. So Brown disabled Moseley's car and ensured that he could not get away before the police had arrived. A detective recalled that a white car had been reported by some of the witnesses to Kitty's murder, and he informed detectives Carroll and Sang. During questioning, Moseley admitted to murdering Kitty and 2 other women, Anna Mae Johnson, who had been shot and burned to death in her apartment in South Ozone Park a few weeks earlier, and 15-year-old Barbara Kralik, who had been killed in her parents' Springfield Gardens home the previous July. Winston Moseley was 29 years old when he murdered Kitty, and he worked from Ozone Park, Queens. He worked at Remington Rand as a tab operator, preparing the punch cards used at the time for data storage for digital computers. He was married with 3 children. He had no criminal record whatsoever. He was basically known as a family man. While in custody, he did confess to killing Kitty, and he detailed the attack. And all of this detailed information collaborated with the physical evidence at the scene. He said that his motive for the attack was literally simply to kill a woman, and that he preferred to kill women because it was easier, because they didn't fight back. And then he stated that he got up that night at around 2 a.m, leaving his wife asleep at home, and drove to Queens to find a victim. He saw Kitty on her way home and followed her to the parking lot before killing her. So Moseley was charged with the murder of Kitty, but he was not charged for the other 2 murders that he admitted to. For the police, there was actually a complicating factor, and that was that another man called Alvin Mitchell had also confessed to the murder of Barbara Kralik. Moseley's trial began on June 8th, 1964, and Moseley initially pleaded not guilty, but his attorney later changed his plea to not guilty by reason of insanity. During his testimony, Moseley described the events on the night he murdered Kitty, along with 2 other murders which he had confessed, and numerous other burglaries and rapes. The jury deliberated for 7 hours before returning a guilty verdict at around 10:30 p.m. on June 11th. On June 15th, Moseley was sentenced to the death for the murder of Kitty. When the jury foreman read the sentence, Moseley showed no emotion, while some spectators actually applauded and cheered. On March 18th in 1968, Moseley actually escaped from prison while being transported back to Maine Memorial Hospital in Buffalo, New York, where he'd undergone minor surgery for a self-inflicted injury. He hit the transporting correctional officer and he actually stole his weapon and fled to a nearby vacant house which was on Grand Island, New York, and it was owned by a couple called the Kalugas. Stayed undetected there for 3 days, but on March 21st the couples actually went to check the house, and that's where they actually encountered Moseley. Moseley bound them up and held them hostage for over an hour. He gagged Mr. Kaluga, but he raped Mrs. Kaluga, and then he took the couple's car and fled. Moseley then travelled to Grand Island, where on March 22nd he broke into another house and he held a woman and her daughter hostage for 2 hours before releasing them unharmed. At this point he was forced to surrender by the police and he was charged with escape and kidnapping, to which he pleaded guilty. Moseley was given 2 additional 15-year sentences to run concurrently with his life sentence. So in September 1971, Moseley participated in the Attica prison riot. Later in the same decade, he obtained a Bachelor of Arts in sociology in prison from Nigeria University. He became eligible for parole in 1984. At the hearing, Moseley claimed that he never intended to kill Kitty and that he considered her murder to be a mugging, because people do kill people when they mug people sometimes. What a guy. The board then denied his request for a parole, and then he returned for a parole hearing on March 13th, 2008, which was actually the 44th anniversary of Kitty's murder. He continued to show little remorse for Kitty's murder and parole was again denied. Kitty's brother Vincent was actually unaware of the 2008 hearing until he was contacted by the New York Daily News reporters. Vincent Genovese has reportedly never recovered from his sister's murder, and Vincent said that the whole family still remembers. Moseley was denied parole for an 18th time in November 2015, and he actually died in prison on March 28th, 2016 at the age of 81. He served 52 years, making him one of the longest serving inmates in the New York prison system. So Kitty's murder was actually reported in a news story by the New York Times, and this is what actually gave rise to the psychological phenomenon known as the bystander effect. The bystander effect is described as an increased disinclination to intervene when in the company of others. So basically it's a bit like what I said earlier. It's this thing of, you see a woman getting mugged in a park for a handbag, for instance, and you think, oh, don't worry, he's going to run after her or he's going to phone the police, and you don't do anything because you think someone else is going to do something. It's that sort of a thing. There is a lot of disputes over whether Kitty's murder is the right example to use, because many people say there were like over 30 witnesses to the murder, but people think that this was maybe a parable used for dramatic effect. There's a lot of people think that this story was wrought with all these witnesses to make it even more shocking, and was that actually the case? So as well as being responsible for the bystander phenomenon, Kitty's murder also played a pivotal role in the development of the 911 emergency phone number in the United States. At the time of Kitty's murder, you would either call the nearest police station or dial 0 to be connected to authorities by a telephone operator. So the story was originally reported in the New York Times, and it has been heavily under scrutiny since it was first published in the spring of 1964. In a 2006 article on the death of Winston Moseley, the newspaper admitted that the original story was flawed in that it did grossly exaggerate the number of witnesses and what they had perceived. So first of all, there were not 37 witnesses to the murder. In fact, there were only 6 witnesses that were actually found to have saw what happened that could be used for trial. Now, it's not to say that there weren't more witnesses that didn't come forward, but officially there were only 6 proper witnesses. Many say that they did hear the attack, but they explained that they assumed it was either someone who was drunk, who'd stumbled out of a bar, which was known. There was a bar nearby called the Old Bailey, which was known for its rowdy clientele. Or many thought that it was just 2 lovers having a bit of a quarrel, a little bit of a tiff. And then there was a Kew Gardens resident and historian called Joseph D. May Jr. has explained that it would be near impossible for so many residents to witness the full attack. While some witnessed the first attack, there were very few that would would have witnessed the second attack after Mosley's return, because by that time Kitty had staggered into a back alley and collapsed into the entryway of an apartment, so she could not be seen by any of the windows of the apartments on Austin Street. The untruthful reporting by the New York Times in 1964 was entirely to blame for shifting attention away from Kitty's murder and onto her neighbours, painting them as heartless and callous individuals. As we now know, the story that was published in the newspaper for the most part was completely baseless. And then there was a guy called Kevin Cook, and he actually wrote in his book, quote, "Kitty Genovese was not killed by apathy, she was killed by a monster named Winston Mosley," end quote. I just think this case is so interesting. I'd love to know what your thoughts and feelings are on this case. I am so glad that he never ever got parole, because in escaping from prison he just proved that he was going to go out and do exactly the same thing again. So I'm glad that he did not get to go back onto the streets. I really hope that Kitty's family have found peace eventually. Like, it's such a terrible thing, and I can imagine, like, I think sometimes when things happen it's that blame game as well, and it's so easy to look for other people to blame other than the perpetrator. But in this case, who knows how many of them neighbours actually saw what happened, who knows who did report and didn't report. It's something that we will never know, but it's so interesting how this case has been so infamously linked to the bystander effect. Anyway guys, I would love to know your thoughts and feelings on this one. Let me know that down below. I hope you have an absolutely wonderful day, and thank you so much for watching. Mwah.